He shoved the ring back across the counter, without even looking at her. "That's not worth my time," Ambrose Vale said, loud enough for the whole auction yard to hear. "What I want is the deed. Sign it over, and maybe I let your children keep the clothes on their backs." 200 people stood in that frozen yard. They heard every word, and not one of them moved. Mara Whitlock was on her knees in the snow. Her hands were shaking, not just from the cold. Her children were at home, huddled under a single quilt, waiting for her to come back with something. Anything. And the most powerful man in Red Mesa County had just told her, in front of everyone she had ever known, that her pain wasn't even worth his attention. If that had been you, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, if you believe that courage deserves to be remembered, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far Story States travels. And if it touches your heart, please hit the like button. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to that frozen yard. Because what happened next changed everything. The morning had started the way most mornings started for Mara Whitlock that winter, with the sound of her children pretending they weren't hungry. Silas, 10 years old, and already trying to carry himself like a man, had told Nell to stop complaining when her stomach growled during breakfast. But there was no breakfast. There hadn't been a real one in 4 days. What Mara had put in front of them that morning was weak broth made from a heel of dried beef she'd been rationing since Tuesday, and 2 biscuits she'd stretched so thin they were almost translucent. Silas had taken half of his and slid it quietly to his sister's side of the table, while pretending to adjust his boot. Mara had watched him do it from across the room. She hadn't said anything. She couldn't trust her voice. 8 months. 8 months since Gideon had died in what the deputy had called a cattle stampede. An accident, unfortunate, nothing to investigate. 8 months of her trying to hold together 200 acres. 40 head of cattle, a cabin with a roof that leaked when the wind shifted west, and 2 children who were running out of reasons to believe their mother when she said things were going to be all right. Because things were not all right. The cattle were underfed, and she'd already lost 6 to the cold. The remaining feed was almost gone. She owed $12 to the grain supply store in town, a debt that felt enormous and humiliating in ways that had nothing to do with the number. And now there was the other thing, the thing she hadn't told the children about. The document Ambrose Vale had sent to her door 3 weeks earlier, delivered by a man on Comstory's Horfus who hadn't even dismounted before he thrust it into her hands. A debt notice. $1,400. With Gideon's signature at the bottom. She'd read it 6 times that first night, sitting at the table after the children were asleep, reading it over and over until her eyes burned, trying to find the piece she was missing. Gideon had never mentioned a debt to Ambrose Vale. Not once. Gideon had never mentioned Ambrose Vale at all, except once to say the man was the kind of person you stayed away from if you had any sense. But there was his signature. Right there. The town auction happened on the first Friday of every month out in the open yard behind the hardware store. Struggling families sold what they could, and the better-off families of Red Mesa County came to buy it cheaply and called themselves generous for attending. Mara had brought 3 things: her husband's good saddle, a silver hair comb that had belonged to her mother, and her wedding ring. She had not cried when she put the ring in her coat pocket that morning. She had made herself a promise about that. The yard was crowded. January had driven the temperature low enough to crack wood, and people stood stamping their feet and pulling their coats tighter. Watch of its windows were dark, watching each item go up with the particular focused attention of people who had nowhere else to be and knew they were getting good prices. Mara stood near the back and waited her turn, holding herself very still, very straight. The way Gideon used to say made her look like she was daring the world to argue with her. She didn't feel like that. She felt like a woman standing in the cold with her dead husband's ring in her pocket, trying to figure out how long she could keep lying to her children about what was coming. Gideon's saddle went for $4.50. She'd hoped for $7. The hair comb went for 80 cents to a woman in a green coat who held it up to the light and made a face like she wasn't sure it was worth even that. Time for the ring. Mara walked to the front of the crowd herself, because she couldn't stand the idea of a stranger holding it up and calling out its virtues to strangers. She held it out on her open palm. This is a gold wedding band, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. My husband gave it to me 14 years ago. It's real gold. It's worth more than I'm asking. I need enough to feed my children and buy feed for my cattle through the end of the month. She paused. That's all I'm asking. The yard went quiet in the way that large crowds go quiet when something uncomfortable is happening, and nobody wants to be the person who makes it worse by reacting. Then Ambrose Vale pushed through to the front. He was not a large man physically, but he carried himself like one. He wore a coat that cost more than most families in that yard earned in a month. And he had the particular careful grooming of a man who spent a great deal of time in front of mirrors. He was 53 years old, and he had been the most powerful man in Red Mesa County for long enough that most people had forgotten what the county felt like before him. He looked at the ring in Mara's hand. Then he looked at Mara. I'll take it, he said, and I'll give you $200 not for the ring. He smiled with just his mouth. For your land. All of it. Sign the deed over today, and we'll call the debt settled. That's me being generous, Mrs. Whitlock. I'd encourage you to think about that. Crowd murmured. Mara's hand closed around the ring. My land is worth considerably more than $200, she said, and I don't owe you anything. The courts disagree. Ambrose reached into his coat and produced a folded document with the unhurried calm of a man who had done this before. Many times before, $1,400, signed by your late husband. You've had 3 weeks to arrange payment. I'm here today, in front of these good people, offering you a way out. He spread his hands in a gesture of elaborate patience. But if you'd rather we let the court define, Mara said. Let the court decide. Something shifted in Ambrose's face. It wasn't anger exactly, it was something colder, the particular expression of a man who is accustomed to being the only person in the room who knows how the story ends. Mrs. Whitlock. His voice dropped, not to a whisper, but to something that felt very precise and very deliberate. I've been patient with you. I want you to understand that. But patience isn't unlimited. There are other options available to me if you continue to be uncooperative. I could raise the question of whether a woman in your circumstances is equipped to be raising 2 children alone. The county has people for that. It would be unfortunate. He held her gaze. Very unfortunate for the children. The sound that came from Mara's chest wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound a person makes when something they'd suspected but hadn't let themselves fully believe becomes real all at once. He was threatening to take her children. She looked around at the crowd. At 200 people she'd known her whole life, people who'd eaten at Gideon's table, who'd held Nell as a baby, who'd watched Silas learn to walk in the churchyard, who'd brought food when Gideon died and told her they were sorry for her loss. 200 faces, and every single one of them was looking at the ground or the sky or the space slightly to the left of where she was standing. Not one of them stepped forward. Mara's knees went out. She didn't decide to kneel. Her legs simply stopped holding her. She went down into the snow with one hand on the auction block to keep herself from going all the way to the ground. And with the other hand, she held out the ring, the ring Gideon had put on her finger in a meadow on a June afternoon when they were both 22 and the world felt enormous and possible. And she said, her voice breaking on every syllable, "Please, somebody, my children are hungry." The silence that followed was the worst thing she'd ever experienced. Worse than the knock on the door the morning they told her about Gideon. Worse than the first night alone. Because silence in the dark is just absence. But silence in front of 200 people who are all choosing not to see you, that's something else entirely. That's a wound that takes a different kind of time to close. She didn't know how long she stayed there. Long enough for her knees to go numb. Then the crowd shifted. Not politely, not subtly, people moved because someone was coming through and wasn't asking permission. She heard him before she saw him. Heavy boots, unhurried, breaking through the packed snow with the particular rhythm of someone who has never once in his life moved faster than he decided to move. A sound like the approach of something large and certain. Rourke Calder was 6 feet 4 inches and built like the Texas landscape he'd spent his whole life on hard, weather past the point where weather mattered anymore. He was 41 years old, and he had a reputation in Red Mesa County that kept most people from looking directly at him. Not because he was violent, though people whispered about that too, but because he had a quality that some men are born with and most never develop, He looked at things exactly as they were, without flinching, without rearranging them in his head to be more comfortable. It made people nervous. People who are in the habit of looking away from things always feel uncomfortable around someone who doesn't. He walked through that crowd like they weren't there. He stopped beside Mara. He looked at her for a moment, not with pity, which she would have hated, and not with the careful, studied concern of someone trying to look compassionate. He just looked at her the way he looked at everything, directly. Then he looked at Ambrose. I heard the number, Rourke said. His voice was not particularly loud, but the yard had gotten very quiet. $1,400. Ambrose straightened slightly. Of its windows were dark. He had seen Rourke Calder in a room before and understood instinctively, as most men did, that Rourke was the kind of person whose opinion of what you were doing tended to more than you wanted it to. This is a private business matter, Ambrose said. The lady and I'll pay it. The crowd reacted to that there was an actual intake of breath, audible, like air rushing into a space that had suddenly been made. Mara's head came up. $1,400. Rourke said again. To Ambrose, as though the crowd and Mara and the whole frozen yard had reduced themselves down to just these two men and the number between them. You'll have it within the week. You'll also hand over whatever document you've got there and whatever copies you've made of it, and then you'll leave this yard. Ambrose's eyes narrowed. I'm not asking. Rourke's voice didn't change in any way that was easy to describe. It just became what it had always been, only more so. Mrs. Whitlock, he said, turning to look down at her. Let me help you up. He held out his hand. A large scarred hand, rough from 40 years of work, with knuckles that had been split and healed more times than he could count. Not the hand of a man who had been gentle with the world. But steady, Mara looked at it. She thought about pride. She thought about what Gideon would say. She thought about Silas at the table, giving his sister half of a biscuit that was barely a biscuit. She thought about the document with her husband's forged signature and 200 people who had watched her kneel in the snow and decided they had somewhere else to look. She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet with the same matter-of-fact ease that he did everything, no drama about it, no ceremony. She was standing. She brushed the snow off her coat. She did not look around at the crowd. Why? She said quietly, low enough that only he could hear, Are you doing this? We don't know each other. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then your husband knew me. A long time ago. He picked up her wedding ring from where it had fallen in the snow and placed it back in her hand, carefully, like it was something that should be handled carefully. Gideon Whitlock saved my life once. I've been carrying that around for 12 years. Consider this the payment. I can't let you... I'm not asking for permission either, he said, and it almost sounded like something that might have been a joke, except his face didn't do much in the way of joking. He looked at her with those direct, uncomfortable eyes. You can argue with me about it later if you want. Right now, you need to get your children some food. She could feel the crowd watching. She could feel Ambrose Vale watching in particular, with an attention that felt different from everyone else's specific, calculating, the attention of someone who is already thinking 3 moves ahead. But she could also feel the ring in her hand. Real gold. 14 years. A meadow in June. Not gone. She hadn't had to sell it after all. Mara Whitlock closed her fingers around her wedding ring and held on. She did not know yet what she was going to find out about her husband's death. She did not know about the hidden journal, or the forged deeds, or the 3 people whose lives had ended in ways that were supposed to look like accidents. She did not know that the man standing beside her had his own reasons for coming to Red Mesa County that winter, reasons that went past a 12-year-old debt, reasons that he hadn't yet found a way to say out loud. She only knew that she was still standing, and that for now was enough to build the next hour on. She walked out of that auction yard with her ring and her dignity, and a stranger walking beside her who kept his word, and behind her she could hear the crowd beginning to talk again in the way crowds do, when the uncomfortable thing has passed 100 different voices discussing what they had just witnessed, deciding what it meant, editing their own silence into something more forgivable in the retelling. Ambrose Vale did not move from where he was standing. He folded the debt document with deliberate slowness and put it back in his coat pocket. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had just decided something. That was almost worse. Because Mara had taken something from Ambrose Vale today that he wasn't accustomed to losing. Not money, not a fight, an audience. For the first time in a very long time, 200 people had watched Ambrose Vale fail to make a woman break, and the man who had stopped him was already walking away. And the crowd was watching the wrong person leave. Ambrose understood what that meant better than anyone. It meant this was not over. It meant it was just beginning. The ride back from town was quiet in a way that had texture to it. Rourke drove the wagon, and Mara sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, and neither of them spoke for the first mile because there wasn't anything obvious to say. He had just paid $1,400 for a debt that wasn't hers. She had just let him. Those were two large facts sitting between them on the wagon seat, and talking around them felt foolish, and talking directly at them felt too soon. The land on either side of the road was flat and winter gray, stripped of color the way West Texas always stripped itself down in January, not dramatic about it, just bare, the way a person looks when they've stopped pretending. Mara watched a hawk circle something in the middle distance and thought about Silas and Nell at home with Mrs. Garrity from the neighboring property, who had agreed to sit with them for the morning. Most of its windows were dark. She thought about what she was going to tell them when she walked through the door. She thought about the look on Ambrose Vale's face when Rourke had said the number. Not angry, deciding. You didn't have to do that, she said finally. I know, I mean it. That's a significant amount of money, mister. Calder, I don't have a way to pay you back. Not anytime soon. Maybe not, I didn't ask you to. I understand that. But I need you to understand that I'm not. She stopped and started again. I'm not someone who accepts charity and pretends it's something else. If this is charity, I need you to say so, and I need to figure out what I can offer in exchange that's fair. And if it's something else, I need you to tell me what the something else is. He was quiet for a moment. The horse's hooves made a steady sound on the frozen ground, and a cold wind came across the flats and pushed against them both without apology. I told you what it is, he said. Your husband saved my life. 12 years ago. Debt doesn't have an expiration date. Rourke. She used his first name without thinking about it, and then felt briefly self-conscious about that. But he didn't react. Gideon would have. Gideon would never have told me about saving someone's life, and then not mentioned owing money to the most powerful man in the county. He told me everything. We didn't keep things from each other. She heard herself say that, and felt the familiar sideways grief of it, the past tense. The word didn't. The way you have to keep conjugating a person's life in the wrong direction forever after they're gone. If there was a legitimate debt, he would have said so. Rourke looked at her sideways, brief, and then back at the road. I know, she turned toward him. You know, I know the debt isn't legitimate. He said it flatly, like stating the weather. I've heard about Vale's methods before. He's done this to other people in the county. The document he's got, I'd stake what's left of my reputation on the fact that signature isn't real. The wagon wheel hit a frozen rut and jolted them both. Neither of them grabbed for the dark, by mutual uns for the other, by mutual unspoken agreement, maintaining the particular careful distance of two strangers who had just done something significant together and hadn't worked out the terms of it yet. Then why did you pay it? Mara said. If you think it's forged, why not say so? In front of everyone? Because saying so without proof just makes me a man who's calling the richest banker in the county a liar in a public yard. Rourke said. Vale's got a judge, 2 deputies, and half the county council in his coat pocket. I've been watching him operate for 3 years. Saying something without proof doesn't stop him. It just warns him. He glanced at her again. Paying the number buys you time. Time to find the proof. Mara sat with that for a moment. You've been watching him, she said slowly. For 3 years. A long pause. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. The hawk had disappeared from the sky. The road curved slightly, and the Whitlock homestead came into view. In the distance, the small cabin with the patched roof, the fence that needed 2 posts replaced, the empty pasture where her remaining cattle huddled together near the feed trough. My wife, Rourke said. She died 3 years ago. Fell from her horse, they said. She was the best rider in the county. He said it without particular emotion, the way a man says a fact he has said before, alone, many times, until the saying of it no longer changes the shape of his breathing. 3 weeks before she died, she'd been looking into some property transactions, deeds that didn't match records. She told me something was wrong with the way land was changing hands around here, that Vale's name kept appearing in places it shouldn't. He paused. Then she fell from her horse. The words landed between them quietly and stayed. Mara felt the back of her neck go cold, in a way that had nothing to do with January. I think I don't have proof, Rourke said, which is the same problem you've got with Gideon's signature on that document. He pulled the horse to a stop at the edge of her property line, at the gate she always meant to fix and never had the time or money for. Which is why I said what I said. About time. He set the brake on the wagon and climbed down, and came around and offered his hand to help her down, and she took it without argument this time, because she was thinking about thinking about Gideon and thinking about a woman who could ride better than anyone in the county and had fallen from her horse 3 weeks after asking the wrong questions. She stood in the cold outside her own gate and looked at the cabin and thought, what if Gideon's death wasn't an accident? She'd thought it before. She'd pushed it away, because the alternative was something she couldn't afford to think about, while she was also trying to feed her children and keep her cattle alive and fight a forged debt. Because grief and suspicion together are a weight that will take a person apart if they let them. But Rourke Calder was standing in front of her saying he'd been watching Ambrose Vale for 3 years and his wife had died asking questions, and Gideon had died 8 months ago in what the deputy called an accident. She looked at him directly. What do we do? He almost looked surprised. Almost. You want to? He threatened my children, she said. In front of 200 people, he threatened to have my children taken from me. Not my land, my children. Her voice was steady because she was making it steady, and it cost her something. So, yes, whatever you're planning to do, whatever you've been working on for 3 years, I want to help. Tell me what we do. Rourke studied her for a moment with those straight-on eyes. First he said, you go inside and feed your children. It wasn't funny exactly, but something about the plainness of it after everything that had happened that morning, the ring and the snow and the crowd's silence and the money and the dead wives and the forged documents, the plainness of it cut through, and Mara laughed. A brief, ragged sound surprised out of her. After that, Rourke said, and almost there was something at the corner of his mouth that could have been mistaken for the beginning of a smile, we go see Lenora Pike. Lenora Pike had run the general store on the main street of Red Mesa for 11 years, since her husband Howard had died of a fever, and she was the kind of woman who knew everything about everyone in the county, because she was the only person in town who had the rare combination of being genuinely interested in other people's lives, and being completely trustworthy with what she learned. She kept it all in her head, cataloged and cross-referenced, accessible the way a good library is accessible if you knew what you were looking for and you asked the right questions. She was also, as it happened, the widow of the former county clerk. Mara and Rourke arrived at the store late that afternoon, after Mara had gone home, held her children, made a real meal with the food money that Rourke had also pressed into her hand before leaving, and that she had also tried to refuse, and that he had also not accepted the refusal of, and told Silas and Nell that things were going to get better. She'd told them this before and said it with less certainty each time. This time she said it and almost believed it herself, which felt like progress. Lenora looked up from behind the counter when they came in, read the room in about 4 seconds the way she read everything, and sent her teenage assistant out the back with a list of inventory to check. Sit down, she said. To both of them, before either of them had said a word, I've got coffee if you want it. And I heard what happened at the auction yard, because this is Red Mesa, and I hear everything. So whatever you're here to ask me, ask it. Howard kept records, Rourke said, from when he was county clerk. Lenora's expression shifted fractionally. Howard kept records of everything. He believed a man's job was to document what actually happened, not what powerful people wished had happened. She looked at her coffee cup. I think that belief may have shortened his life. But that's not a conversation I've been able to prove well enough to have out loud. I need to know about Gideon Whitlock's deed, Mara said. The original one. From when we filed it. I know which deed you mean. Lenora stood up and went to the back of the store, moving with purpose, and they heard her rummaging through something for a full 2 minutes before she came back, carrying a box that had once held bolts of fabric and now contained stacked paper files, bundled carefully with twine. Howard brought copies home, she said. Not all of them, but certain ones toward the end. She stopped. I think he was worried. I think he brought home the ones he thought someone might try to make disappear. She set the box on the counter and began going through it with practiced efficiency. Marha watched her hands moving through the papers and felt the particular suspended feeling of standing at a hinge point, the moment just before you find out whether the thing you're hoping is true actually is, and the knowing that once you find out, you can't unfind out, and the world will either open up or close down, and you won't know which until it happens. Here, Lenora said. She put a document on the counter. Mara looked at it. Her own name, and Gideon's, and the date 15 years ago, the year after they'd built the cabin. 200 acres. No encumbrances, no debt, no mention of Ambrose Vale. At the bottom, Gideon's signature, the real one, the one she knew, like she knew her own handwriting, with the particular way he always overcrossed his T's because he'd learned to write from a left-handed school teacher. She put her finger on the signature and felt something shift in her chest. This is real, she said. That's the original, Lenora said. Or Howard's copy of it, taken the day it was filed. She hesitated. The signature on Ambrose's document, I haven't seen it, but I'd wager everything I own that it doesn't cross the T's the same way. Gideon always did. Howard used to say it was so distinctive you could identify it from across a room. Was looking at the document with the concentrated attention of someone memorizing it. We need someone who can testify to the original, someone who was there when it was filed. Orson Vale, Lenora said immediately. He was Howard's assistant at the time. He actually processed the Whitlock deed. He's retired now, lives on the far end of Miller Road, but his mind is perfectly sound. She paused. I should warn you, Orson is 73 years old and he doesn't like conflict. Getting him to testify publicly is going to take some doing. Let me try, Mara said. Lenora looked at her with the particular assessment of a woman who has watched many people try many things and has a fairly accurate sense of what works. All right, she said, but there's something else you need to know. She reached back into the box and pulled out 3 more documents, each bundled separately, each with a name written on the outside in careful handwriting that Mara didn't recognize. Howard wasn't just worried about your deed, Lenora said quietly. He was worried about these. She laid them on the counter one at a time. The Sutton property, the Adler farm, the Marsh homestead, 3 other families, all widows, all in financial difficulty, all of whom lost their properties to debt claims within the last 6 years. She looked at Mara steadily, all of whose deeds in the county records now show debt obligations that Howard's copies don't include. The silence in the store was very complete. He's done this before, Mara said, multiple times. At least 3 times that Howard documented, possibly more. Lenora stacked the documents carefully and put them back in the box. And after each one, the property changed hands inside 18 months and sold again at 3 to 4 times the price. Rourke said, "There's a railroad coming." Lenora looked at him. "Proposed route hasn't been announced officially. It hasn't been announced publicly," Rourke said. "But the route's been known to certain people for a while. People with enough money and enough connections to know where to buy land before the announcement makes the price jump." He looked at Mara. "Your property sits directly across this most efficient path through this county." Mara thought about the auction yard that morning, about Ambrose's offer. $200 for land that, if Rourke was right, was about to be worth several thousand. She thought about Gideon refusing to sell, arguing with someone in the dark the night before he died. "I want to talk to Orson Vale," she said. "Today. Right now." "Getting dark," Rourke said. "I know." He looked at her and made the same calculation she'd seen him make once before reading her, the way he read everything, straight and without flinching, and then he nodded once. "I'll drive." Orson Vale lived in a house that had once been white and was now the color of old cream, set back from the road behind a line of bare elms that rattled their branches in the evening wind. He answered the door in his slippers and a heavy wool cardigan, holding a lamp, and looked at the 2 people on his porch with the expression of a man who recognized trouble when it came knocking and had been half expecting it for a while. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. He didn't look surprised. "I heard about the auction yard. May we come in?" Mara said. He stepped back and let them in. The house was warm and cluttered, with the specific comfortable clutter of a man who lives alone but doesn't particularly mind it, books stacked on chairs, a half-finished checkers game on the table, dishes that had been washed and left to air, rather than put away. He moved some papers off 2 chairs and gestured for them to sit, and then settled himself across from them with his hands on his knees and the expression of a man preparing to do something he'd been putting off. "I processed your deed," he said before Mara could ask anything. 15 years ago. I remember it because I remember most of the deeds I processed in those years, and I remember yours particularly because your husband came in with both children. Silas was just a baby. You'd left him with Howard while you handled the cattle, and Gideon sat right across from me at that desk and signed his name and then looked at me and said, "That's my children's future right there." Stuck with me. He looked at Mara steadily. There was no debt. There was no obligation to Ambrose Vale or anyone else. The land was clean. "Would you testify to that?" Rourke said, publicly. Orson's hands tightened on his knees. He looked at the floor for a moment, at his slippers at the middle distance that people look at when they're working something out, that costs them something. "Ambrose Vale is not a man who takes opposition lightly," Orson said carefully. "No," Rourke agreed. "He's not. Howard Pike was a man who documented things carefully and honestly, and Howard Pike died of a fever at 51 years old that nobody could quite explain." Orson said it quietly, without drama, like a fact he'd been carrying for a long time. "I'm 73, and I live alone, and I'm well aware that accidents happen to people who say inconvenient things in this county." Mara leaned forward. "Mr. Vale, he's going to take my land. He's threatened to take my children. And if what Lenora Pike showed us today is right, he's already done this to at least 3 other families." She paused. "I'm not asking you to do this for me. I'm asking you to think about the other people who might be in that auction yard next month or the month after with their ring in their hand and 200 people who won't look at them." Orson looked at her for a long time. He was the first person all day, Mara realized, who had looked at her the way she needed someone to look at her, not with pity, not with calculation, not with the careful blankness of someone trying not to get involved. He looked at her like she was a person worth looking at properly. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's all I can give you tonight. I'll think about it." It wasn't yes. But the way he said it felt different from no. On the ride back, the temperature had dropped far enough that their breath made visible clouds in the dark, and the sussers over West Texas were the kind of thick and indifferent that they get when the air is cold enough to make them sharp. Mara sat with the copy of Howard's deed in her coat and Orson's half parmes in her head, and the smell of Lenora's store still faintly on her coat. "He'll say yes," she said. "Not a question." "Probably," Rourke said. "People who've been carrying a thing for a long time usually want to put it down eventually." Mara thought about Rourke carrying his wife's death for 3 years. Watching were dark, watching Ambrose from a distance, building something methodical and patient, waiting for the moment or the evidence or the right person to come along. She thought about what it cost a person to be that patient with that kind of grief, and how much it must have looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. "Thank you," she said, "for today." He didn't answer right away. "Then don't thank me yet." "Why not?" "Because Vale knows you have help now, and that's going to make him move faster." He looked straight ahead at the dark road. "Tomorrow he's going to do something. I don't know what, but he's not a man who lets a setback sit overnight." He was right. Mara found out the next morning. She was in the barn, checking on the cattle feed that had arrived the previous afternoon. Rourke had arranged it before he left the night before, which she'd also tried to argue with and lost, which was becoming a pattern she hadn't entirely decided how to feel about when Silas came running from the cabin with his coat half on. "Mama, someone's here." The man on the horse was one of Ambrose's regular hands, recognizable by the particular brand on his horse's flank and the way he sat like someone who's been told he's more important than he is. He handed Mara an envelope without getting down. She opened it there in the cold, with Silas watching. It was a notice. The property hearing which she'd been told was scheduled for 30 days out had been moved. She had 3 days. 3 days to appear before Circuit Judge Horace Bellamy, produce documentation disputing the debt claim, and argue her case. 3 days, which was not enough time to organize anything, gather witnesses, compile evidence, or prepare legal arguments. 3 days, which was, Mara understood immediately, precisely the point. She looked at the man on the horse. He wasn't quite meeting her eyes. "Tell your employer," she said, carefully folding the notice, "that I received his message." The man rode off. Silas stood beside her in the cold and looked up at her with his father's eyes and his father's habit of waiting for her to say what she actually meant rather than what she was supposed to say. "How bad is it?" he said. She looked at her son, 10 years old, carrying himself like a man, giving his sister half his food, getting up every morning and doing his chores without being asked and not crying, not once, in the 8 months since his father died, because he'd decided, in whatever way 10-year-old boys decide things, that the family needed someone to not be crying. She had wanted to protect him from all of it. She understood standing there in the January, cold holding a notice that gave her 3 days to fight a corrupt judge on a corrupt timeline, that she was not going to be able to protect him from any of it. "It's manageable," she said, "Mama. It's hard," she corrected. "It's very hard. But we have help, and I'm going to figure it out." He nodded. He looked back toward the cabin where Nell was still inside, and then back at his mother. Dad used to say that problems that feel impossible usually just haven't been looked at from the right angle yet. Mara held very still for a moment. "He did say that," she said. "Are you looking at this from the right angle?" She thought about Lenora's box of documents, about Orson Vale in his wool cardigan saying, "I'll think about it," in a way that sounded like the beginning of yes. About Rourke saying that Vale's move meant he was scared, and that a scared man was a man making mistakes. "I'm working on the angle," she said. She sent Silas inside and walked to the fence line and stood in the cold and thought. 3 days. Judge Horace Bellamy, who had been compromised by Ambrose Vale's money and influence for long enough that most people had stopped expecting anything different from him. A legal process that was designed to look fair while being controlled at every point by the same man who'd forged Gideon's signature. She couldn't win inside that system. The system was Ambrose's, which meant she had to think about what was outside it. She was standing at the fence for almost 20 minutes before it came to her. When it did, it was not a complicated idea. It was actually very simple, which was probably why it felt right. Ambrose's power in Red Mesa County was built on silence, on people looking away, on the 200 people in the auction yard who hadn't stepped forward. Courthouse was controlled. But the town square wasn't. She needed to get back to Rourke. She needed to get back to Lenora and Orson. And she needed, urgently, to figure out whether the man who'd been seen outside Gideon's property the night before he died, the man Ambrose had sent to threaten her husband into selling, was still wearing his badge. Because Nell had heard an argument that night. And Nell, who was 7 years old and noticed everything, and had told no one because no one had ever asked the right questions, might be the most important witness Mara had, her daughter, the one she'd been trying hardest to protect. Mara turned from the fence and walked back to the cabin. Lenora's store had burned to the ground the following morning. The fire was discovered at dawn by a farmer passing on his way to market, by which time the building was already past saving. Nobody was inside. Lenora lived in the house behind it and had smelled the smoke early enough to get out. She stood in the cold morning watching 11 years of her life go to ash, and she didn't cry, which frightened her more than the fire did, because she'd always thought of herself as a person who cried, and the fact that she was past crying meant something had shifted in her that she wasn't sure she could shift back. Rourke arrived at the scene within an hour of Mara's message reaching him. He stood beside Lenora in the ash and looked at what was left and asked, quietly, "The box." "I moved it last night," Lenora said. "After you left. I had a feeling." She looked at the ruins of her store. "Howard always said I had good instincts. I thought it was a compliment. I'm less sure now." The box was in Lenora's house, behind the false wall in the pantry that Howard had built, for reasons he'd never fully explained, but that were becoming, in retrospect, extremely clear. Along with the box, someone had left a message, not in the store that was already gone, but on the door of Lenora's house. A single piece of paper, nailed to the wood. It read, "What's already burned doesn't need to burn again." Mara read it standing in the cold outside Lenora's door, and felt a very clear, very specific, very focused anger. Not the hot, scattered anger of grief, the cold, directional kind. The kind that doesn't burn itself out because it has somewhere to go. She had 3 days. She had a box of documents. She had an old man who was thinking about saying yes. She had a 7-year-old daughter who had heard an argument in the dark. And she had a man standing beside her who'd been carrying his own version of this same fight for 3 years. Waiting for exactly this, for someone who was angry enough, and hurt enough, and clear-eyed enough to stop waiting for the system to fix itself. He thinks he's winning, she said. Rourke looked at the sign on Lenora's door. He thinks he's closing the door. He's not, Mara said. He's just shown us exactly how scared he is. She pulled the notice from her coat. 3 days, Judge Bellamy. The courthouse Ambrose owned. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at the town square, visible at the end of the street, empty in the early morning cold, surrounded by the buildings and storefronts of a town that had watched a woman kneel in the snow and done nothing. We're not going to the courthouse, she said. Rourke turned to look at her. We're going to make him come to us, Mara said, in front of everyone, where he can't control who's watching. Lenora had stopped looking at the ruins of her store and was looking at Masa instead. What do you need? She said. Mara thought about the 200 people in the auction yard, about how fast a crowd can decide to look at something instead of away from it, if what it's looking at is clear enough and the right person is doing the looking. I need everybody, she said. Every family he's cheated. Every person who saw what he did at the auction and said nothing and has been carrying that around since. Every neighbor who owes him money, or is scared of his judge, or thinks there's nothing to be done. She looked at both of them. I need this county to see what Ambrose Vale actually is. All at once. Where he can't control the room because there is no room. She put the notice back in her pocket, and then she said, I need Wade Mercer to answer for where he was the night Gideon died. The hardest conversation Mara had in those 3 days wasn't with Orson Vale, and it wasn't with Wade Mercer, and it wasn't with the families she and Lenora visited one by one in the days before the hearing, sitting in cold kitchens and asking people to be brave in ways they hadn't been before. The hardest conversation was with Nell. She'd been putting it off since the morning after the fire, when the idea had fully formed and she'd understood what it required. She'd told herself she was waiting for the right moment, but the truth was simpler and less flattering than that. She was afraid, not of what Nell might say, of what it would mean that her 7-year-old daughter had been carrying something this heavy, alone, for 8 months, because no one had thought to ask. She found Nell in the evening after Silas had gone to check on the cattle. The girl was sitting at the table with a piece of charcoal and paper, drawing the way she always did when she was thinking, not pictures of things exactly, but shapes, connected and overlapping, like a language she'd invented for herself that nobody else could read. Mara sat down across from her. Nell, she said, I need to ask you something about the night before Papa died. Nell's hand stopped moving on the paper. She didn't look up right away. She was 7, but she'd always been the kind of 7 that made adults recalibrate what 7 meant. She felt things at a frequency most children hadn't developed yet, and she knew, in the wordless way perceptive children know things, when an adult was about to ask her something that the adult was afraid to ask. Okay, Nell said, quietly. Do you remember waking up that night, hearing voices outside? Nell put the charcoal down. She looked at her hands. I didn't know if I was supposed to tell, she said. You were so sad after, and then you were so busy being not sad so me and Silas wouldn't be scared. I didn't want to make it worse. Mara felt the particular specific pain of a parent understanding that their child has been protecting them. It's a pain that doesn't have a clean name. It sits somewhere between gratitude and grief, and the sharp particular guilt recognizing that your child grew up a little faster than they should have because of something you couldn't prevent. You can tell me now, Mara said, whatever you remember. Nell looked up. There was a man, she said. He had a badge. I saw it when the lamp was on. He was standing right outside the window, and the lamplight came through, and I could see the badge on his coat. She paused. He was angry. His voice was like when grown-ups try to sound quiet, but they're not really quiet. She thought about it. Papa said no, over and over. He kept saying no, and the man kept saying I couldn't hear all of it. Something about selling. And then the man left, and Papa came inside, and he looked. She stopped. What did he look like? Mara said softly. Scared, Nell said. Papa looked scared, and Papa was never scared of anything. She looked at her mother with her serious dark eyes. Except maybe bad things happening to us. He was scared of that. Mara reached across the table and held her daughter's hand. You did nothing wrong, she said. None of this is your fault. And you are not in trouble for not telling me sooner. Do you understand that? Nell nodded. Then is the man going to get in trouble? I'm working on it. Mara said. Good, said Nell, with a calm, firm certainty that was so completely Gideon's that Mara had to look away for a moment. Deputy Wade Mercer was not the kind of man who had gone into law enforcement out of conviction. He'd taken the badge because Ambrose Vail had offered it, back when Wade was 26 and broke and newly arrived in Red Mesa County with no particular skills and a talent for being agreeable with men who had money. 12 years later, Wade was 38, still agreeable, still broke in the ways that mattered not for lack of a salary, but for lack of anything that was actually his, any choice he'd made that was actually his own. Ambrose owned his badge. Ambrose owned his silence. Ambrose owned in the particular way that powerful men own the people they've compromised, the part of Wade Mercer that might once have been worth something. He was eating lunch alone at the back table of the Red Mesa Tavern when Rourke Calder sat down across from without asking. Wade looked at him. He set his fork down. He had the practiced stillness of a man who had learned to read rooms quickly and was reading this one and not liking what he found. I'm off duty, Wade said. That's fine, Rourke said. What I want to talk about isn't official business. I'm also not interested in conversation. I know Rourke put his hands on the table flat, unhurried, but I think you're going to want to hear this one, because it has to do with what happens to you in 3 days when Mara Whitlock stands up in a public place and says the name of the man with a deputy's badge who was at her homestead the night before her husband died. The color in Wade's face did something complicated. Can't prove she has a witness, Rourke said. 7 years old. Saw your badge through the window by lamplight. He held Wade's eyes. A jury in this territory is going to have a particular feeling about testimony from a 7-year-old girl whose father died the next morning. I expect you know that. Wade picked up his fork and put it down again. The tavern was quiet around them midday, a handful of other men scattered at other tables, nobody paying obvious attention. What do you want? Wade said. What happened that night, Rourke said. All of it. And then I want you to say it again. In public. On Sunday morning, in the town square. You're out of your mind. Possibly. Rourke leaned forward slightly. Wade, I've watched Ambrose Vail operate for 3 years. I know how this works. He's got you tied up the same way. He's got everybody tied up. He knows something you don't want known. Or he's owed you something you can't pay back. Or he's made you afraid of what happens if you stop being useful to him. He paused. But here's what you need to think about. Right now you're complicit in whatever happened to Gideon Whitlock. You were the last person to see him alive, near as we can tell. When this comes out, and it is coming out, on Sunday, in front of this whole county, you have 2 choices. You can be the man who was there and stayed silent. Or you can be the man who was there and finally told the truth. He sat back. Those 2 men are going to have very different lives after Sunday. Wade stared at the table for a long time. He told me to threaten him, Wade said finally, his voice low, eyes still down. To go there and tell him that if he didn't sign the deed over, things would get difficult. For his family, he swallowed. Gideon told me to get off his property. He wasn't afraid. He was angry. He said Ambrose could take his threats and bury them. I left. He looked up. I left Calder. I was gone before midnight. Whatever happened after, I believe you, Rourke said. Wade blinked. Clearly not the response he'd expected. But the county doesn't know that, Rourke continued. Ambrose knows that if this goes to a real investigation, the first person they look at is you. You were there. Your badge puts you at the scene, and if Ambrose decides you're more useful as a suspect than a deputy, you'll find yourself carrying this alone. He let that sit. That? Wade's jaw tightened. I need time to think, he said. You have until Sunday morning, Rourke said, and stood up. I'd use it. The 2 days between Rourke's conversation with Wade and Sunday morning were the most exhausting days of Mara's life, and her life had recently contained some significant competition for that title. She and Lenora split the county between them, visiting families that Ambrose had cheated or pressured or threatened, sitting in parlors and on porch steps and in barn doorways, making the same case over and over with slightly different words, depending on who they were talking to. Some said no immediately. A woman named Ruth Adler, who'd lost her farm 4 years ago and now rented a room above the harness shop, listened to Mara's whole account and then said, I appreciate you coming, Mrs. Whitlock, but I've got nothing left to lose and I've still got reasons to be careful. And those two things don't cancel each other out the way people seem to think they do. Mara had wanted to argue and stopped herself because Ruth was right, and pushing her would have been unkind, and Mara was trying to be the kind of person who could tell the difference. Others were slower and more uncertain, but eventually moved like the Sutton family, who listened in silence, and then the older son, maybe 20, looked at his mother and said quietly, "I want to go," and his mother had nodded once, like something long held had finally been released. Orson Vale said yes on the second day. He came to Mara's door in the morning, still in his wool cardigan, and stood on the porch and said, "I'll do it. I've been thinking about it since you left. And I keep thinking about Gideon Whitlock sitting across from me saying, 'That's my children's future.' And I keep thinking that if I say nothing now, then what exactly was Howard doing all those years he kept those papers safe?" He looked at her steadily. "I'll do it," Mara said. "Thank you," and meant it in every direction at once. The night before the hearing, Lenora came to the cabin with the box of documents. She also came with something else, something she'd found that afternoon, which she'd kept to herself until she was certain it was what she thought it was, because she was a woman who had learned the difference between a feeling and a fact and tried to deal only in facts. She set it on the table after the children were in bed. A journal, small, bound in dark leather, the pages thick and close written in Howard Pike's careful clerk's hand. Mara picked it up. "Where?" she said. "Howard buried it," Lenora said. "There's an abandoned cemetery about a mile and a half east of the Adler property it's from, before the town was properly settled, barely marked. Howard took me there once, years ago, when we were first married. He said it was a good place to remember that most things that feel permanent are temporary." She paused. "I went there this afternoon because I was out of other ideas, and I remembered he'd said the oldest marker had a loose stone at its base, and She stopped. "I found it." "What does it say?" Rourke said. He was sitting in the chair by the window, as he'd taken to doing in the evenings these last 3 days, not making himself at home exactly, but present, the way a person is present who has decided that being present is the right thing. "It says everything," Lenora said. "Every transaction, every forged deed, every bribe paid and received, every piece of land that passed through Ambrose Vale's hands under fraudulent circumstances, going back 8 years. She looked at Mara, and a specific entry, about 6 weeks before Gideon died. Howard had heard that Ambrose sent Wade to your property. He recorded the date, the approximate time, and what he'd been told about the purpose of the visit. She paused. And below that entry, Howard wrote, "If Whitlock refuses, I'm afraid of what comes next. This man is not accustomed to refusal." The kitchen was very quiet. Mara turned the journal in her hands. She thought about Howard Pike, who had died of an unexplained fever at 51, who had years carefully documenting the wrong things his county was doing, and then buried the proof in a cemetery because he didn't know what else to do with it. She thought about Gideon, who had also known something was wrong, and had also refused to bend to it, and had also paid a price that was too large and too permanent. She thought about the men in this county who had seen what was right and had been afraid, and the women who had also been afraid and had somehow done it anyway, and the difference between those two groups that wasn't courage, exactly, it was something more specific. It was the particular thing that happens when a person understands that being afraid and staying silent is still a choice, and that choices have shapes that last. "Sunday," Mara said. "Sunday," Lenora agreed. Rourke said nothing. He was looking at her with the expression she'd started to recognize: straight, direct, without softening, and she'd started to understand that this was not him being hard, it was him being honest, and that for a man like Rourke Calder, those two things had been the same for so long they'd become indistinguishable. Sunday morning came in cold and pale, the sky the particular white of a January day that hasn't decided yet what it's going to do. Mara was up before first light. She dressed in the dark, put on the coat that had Gideon's deed in the pocket and the copy of Howard's original document, and stood at the window for a moment looking at the dark shape of the cattle in the pasture. Silas appeared behind her, already dressed. "You're supposed to be asleep," she said. "I know," he said. "Can I come?" She looked at him. He was 10, and he had his father's chin and his father's habit of holding eye contact a beat longer than was comfortable, as though he was taking the full measure of whoever he was looking at. "Yes," she said, "but you stay close to me." Nell had emerged, was also awake and also already dressed, which suggested that both children had decided independently and in advance they were coming regardless of what she said, and that the performance of being asleep had been a courtesy extended to her rather than a genuine attempt at deception. They arrived at the town square at 7 in the morning. Lenora was already there, the box under her arm. Orson Vale arrived 10 minutes later, driving himself in a small wagon, moving stiffly but purposefully. The Sutton family came the mother and both sons. Two of the other families, whose names were in Howard's journal, appeared on the far side of the square, standing close together in the way people stand when they're not sure if they're in the right place but have decided to stay anyway. And then, gradually, the square began to fill. Mara had not announced a formal event. She'd asked Lenora to mention it, and Lenora had mentioned it to every person she'd spoken to in 2 days. And those people had mentioned it to others, and Red Mesa County did what small communities do when something is clearly happening. That everyone already knows about people came. Farmers in their work coats, shopkeepers who'd opened early and then locked up again, women with children at their sides, old men who'd seen many things and wanted to see this one. By 8 o'clock, there were close to 300 people in that square. Mara stood at the center of it and tried not to count them, because counting them made her aware of all the ways this could go wrong. Silas was at her right. Nell was at her left, her small hand tucked into Mara's, warm and steady. Ambrose Vale arrived at 8:15. He had not been invited. He had heard because Ambrose always heard, because he had people everywhere whose job was to hear things, and he had come because he could not afford not to. A gathering of this size, involving Mara Whitlock, was a threat that needed to be managed in person. He came with 2 men at his back, large and professionally expressionless, and he came in his good coat, and he walked to the center of that square, with the particular measured calm of a man who has faced hostile rooms before and controlled them. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Mara. He looked at the box under Lenora's arm, and at Orson standing beside them, and at the families from his journal arranged in a loose group to the left. And for just a fraction of a second brief, quickly controlled something moved across Ambrose Vale's face that Mara had never seen there before. He hadn't expected this many people. Mrs. Whitlock. His voice was even almost warm, performed for an audience. Whatever you think you're accomplishing here, I'd encourage you to remember that there is a legal process in place, and that's circumventing it. I'm not circumventing anything, Mara said. Her voice carried. She hadn't planned to be loud. The square was just quiet enough that she didn't need to be. I'm exercising my right to speak. In my county. In front of my neighbors. She held his gaze. And I have some things to show them. Ambrose's jaw tightened by a fraction. This is a performance. You have no legal standing. Let her speak. The voice came from the crowd. Mara didn't see who said it. Then another voice from a different direction. Let her speak. And then the phrase moved through the crowd like something passing along water. Not loud, not angry, just a steady, persistent human sound. 3 words repeated until Ambrose understood that managing this particular room was not going to work the way other rooms had worked. Mara held up the document from Howard's box. This is a copy of my original deed taken by former county clerk Howard Pike the day it was filed. It contains no debt, no obligation to Ambrose Vale. She turned it so the people nearest could see it. The document Mr. Vale has been using to claim ownership of my land was forged. Howard Pike knew it. He documented it. And he kept the documentation safe, even when he understood what keeping it safe might cost him. She nodded to Lenora, who opened the box. Howard kept records of every fraudulent transaction he found, Mara continued. Every deed that was altered. Every debt that was manufactured. 3 other families lost their land this way. Their names are in these documents. Their properties were purchased by Ambrose Vale at a fraction of their value and resold within 18 months at 4 times the price. She looked at the crowd, and most of those properties sit along the proposed route of the new railroad spur. The murmuring that went through the crowd was not the polite, uncertain sound of people hearing something surprising. It was the sound of people hearing something they'd half known, and finally being given permission to say so out loud. Ambrose stepped forward. These are allegations. Unsubstantiated. Orson Vale, Mara said. Orson stepped forward. He moved carefully, the way a 73-year-old man moves in cold weather, but he moved. He faced the crowd, and he spoke clearly, because he was a former county clerk, and he had spent 50 years understanding that clarity was the first obligation of a man who handled public records. "I processed the Whitlock deed 15 years ago," Orson said. "I was present when both Gideon and Mara Whitlock signed it. There was no debt attached. There was no obligation to any creditor. The land was filed clean." He paused. "The signature on the document Mr. Vale has been presenting is not the signature I watched Gideon Whitlock make at that desk. I would stake my name on that in any court in this territory." Ambrose turned toward Orson, and his voice shifted, still controlled, but thinner. "You're an old man presenting a 40-year-old memory as testimonies." "He's presenting 40 years of professional experience with legal documents," Mara said, "which is more than you're presenting." She reached into her coat and produced Howard's journal. The crowd went very still. She didn't read from it. She didn't need to. She simply held it up and said, "This is Howard Pike's journal, former county clerk, found 3 days ago in a location known only to his widow. In it, Howard documented 8 years of fraudulent land transactions, including a specific entry about the night Ambrose Vale sent a man with a badge to my homestead to threaten my husband into selling." She looked directly at Ambrose. "A man with a badge who was there the night before Gideon died." Ambrose's face did something then that Mara would remember for the rest of her life. It didn't collapse. It didn't crumble. It went tight, a specific, controlled, furious tightness, like something being compressed too hard, and in that tightness she could see, clearly, and for the first time, what Ambrose Vale actually was underneath the coat and the patience and the performed generosity. He was a man who had never once been caught, and he was beginning to understand that today was going to be different. He started. "Wade." Rourke's voice from the edge of the crowd. The people nearest Wade Mercer stepped back slightly, creating a small open space around him. He was in his deputy's coat, badge visible, standing very still. He'd arrived sometime in the last 20 minutes, without Mara noticing, which meant he'd made his decision before he got here. Wade walked to the center of the square. He didn't look at Ambrose. He looked at Mara. "I was at your property," he said, "the night before your husband died. Ambrose sent me there." He said it without embellishment, without drama, the way a man says something true that he's been saying false versions of for so long that the true version feels strange in his mouth. "I was told to threaten him into signing. He refused. I left," he paused. "I left and Gideon Whitlock was alive when I rode away. But I knew what I'd been sent to do, and I knew what it meant that he'd said no, and I said nothing afterward because Ambrose Vale had enough on me to make silence easier than the alternative." He swallowed. "It wasn't easier. I've known for 8 months that it wasn't easier. I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitlock. That's not worth much. But it's the truth." The square was so quiet that when a horse shifted its weight at the hitching post on the far end, the sound was audible. Mara looked at Wade Mercer. She thought about what he'd said the way he'd said it, the particular deflation of a man who has been propping up a lie for so long that putting it down changes his entire posture. She thought about how she felt about him. She didn't have an answer to that yet. That was a feeling that needed time and privacy, and she couldn't afford either right now. She looked at Ambrose. He was looking at Wade with an expression that had moved past controlled and into something raw. Most of its windows were dark, something that looked almost like what it was, the shock of a man discovering that the person he was most sure of had stopped being sure. "You can't," Ambrose said to Wade, and then stopped. "He just did," Rourke said quietly. Ambrose turned to face the crowd, and what Mara watched happen in the next 30 seconds was something she could not have entirely anticipated, even having planned every other part of this morning. Because Ambrose Vale, confronted with documents and witnesses and testimony and 300 people and a deputy who'd finally spoken, made a choice. Whether it was panic or arrogance, or the particular delusion of a man who has controlled every situation he's been in for so long that he's lost the ability to recognize a situation he can't control, he made a choice. He tried to explain himself. "The railroad is coming regardless," he said. His voice was loud, carrying the voice of a man making an argument he was still sure was logical even as the room shifted under him. This county needed someone to manage that process. Someone understood what was coming. Those families would have lost their land anyway. I gave them fair value. You gave Ruth Adler $400 for a farm that sold 18 months later, for $2,000, Lenora said from where she stood. Quiet, factual, the voice of a woman who deals in numbers. You forged my husband's signature, Mara said, and my husband died the day after he told your deputy he wouldn't sell. I didn't, Ambrose started. The railroad, Mara said, and the crowd went quieter than it had been all morning, because her voice had gone quiet too, quiet in the particular way of something that has moved through anger into something colder and more permanent. That's why. That's what Gideon was worth to you. A piece of a railroad easement. She looked at him. He was supposed to sell. Is that what you said to Wade? He was supposed to sell? And Ambrose, cornered, exposed, stripped down to the fact of himself, in front of 300 people, said the thing that finished him. He was supposed to sell, he said. The water rights, the railroad, the land, it was all arranged. He was the last piece. If he just stopped. He hurt himself. Square heard him. 300 people heard Ambrose Vail explain why Gideon Whitlock had been worth threatening, worth pressuring, worth sending a deputy to, in the dark, to force his hand. Most of its windows were dark. They heard him say it was all arranged, and he was the last piece, and if they understood, in the way that crowds understand things, when the thing is finally said plainly enough, exactly what had been done to a family in their county, and why it had been done, and who had decided it was worth doing. Ambrose looked at the crowd. For the first time in Mara's experience of him, he had nothing to add. He looked at the faces around him, his neighbors, his debtors, his customers, people who had attended his dinners and taken his money, and looked the other way when he asked them to, and he saw that the thing that had always kept him safe in this county, the collective decision to keep looking the other way, was no longer operative. 300 people were looking directly at him. Circuit Judge Horace Bellamy, who had arrived at the edge of the square 20 minutes earlier, and had been standing the square 20 minutes ever since with the expression of a man calculating the personal cost of various available positions, cleared his throat from somewhere in the crowd. In light of what has been presented here today, he said that, in the careful voice of a man who has just decided that being on a sinking ship was worse than the cost of swimming, I'm postponing the property hearing pending a full review of the documentation. He paused. And I'm requesting that territorial law enforcement be notified of the circumstances. Ambrose turned toward him. But Horace Bellamy, for the first time in a long time, was looking somewhere other than at Ambrose Vail. Mara's of its were dark. Mara stood in the center of the square while the crowd began to move around her, the particular organized chaos of 300 people absorbing something large and deciding what to do with it. She felt Nell's hand tighten in hers. She felt Silas standing at her right side, absolutely still, the way his father used to stand when something important was happening, and he wanted to take all of it in. She looked at the space where Ambrose had been standing. Two of the men from the county were moving toward him with a purposeful, official quality to their movement. She looked at Howard's journal in her hand. She looked at Rourke, who was watching her from across the square with those straight, honest eyes that never softened the picture, but never made it crueler than it was. She thought about Gideon, about the night he'd stood outside their cabin in the dark, refusing a man with a badge because he knew what that property meant and what it was for and who it was for, and he'd said no even knowing it was dangerous, and even knowing he was alone. He hadn't been wrong. That was the thing. The land was still there. The children were still there. The deed in her coat pocket was still real. Gideon had been right, and the fact that it had cost him everything was the most devastating thing about being right, sometimes. Mara held her daughter's hand, and her son stood beside her, and the crowd moved around all three of them, and Ambrose Vail was being asked, with increasing insistence, to accompany two men he didn't know to a place he didn't want to go, and none of it felt like winning. Exactly. It felt like something settling. Not cleanly, nothing in life settles cleanly, but settling nonetheless, the way ground settles after something large has been moved from it. The weight was still there. It would always be there. But she was still standing under it. And that, she had learned, was the part that mattered. The square emptied slowly. The way crowds empty when they've witnessed something, they're still processing people leaving in small clusters, talking in low voices, casting glances back over their shoulders as though the thing they'd just seen might still be there if they looked at the right angle. Mara stayed until almost everyone was gone. She wasn't sure why. Partly she didn't trust her legs to carry her through a crowd at a normal pace just yet. Partly she needed a moment that wasn't in front of anyone, not Rourke, not the children, not Lenora, not the families who'd stood in that square with her and paid their own price to do it. She needed 30 seconds of being alone inside the decision she'd just made, because it was only now, with Ambrose gone and the square mostly empty, and the cold settling back into the air, that the full weight of what had happened was making its way through her. She had done it, and she had no idea what came next. That was the part nobody told you about the moments you spend years building toward. The moment itself takes maybe 20 minutes. And then it's over, and you're standing in an empty square in January, and a roof that leaks, and two children who need lunch, and the world has changed enormously, and also not at all. And you have to figure out how to live in both versions of it at the same time. Nell tugged her hand. "Can we go home now?" "Yes," Mara said. "We can go home." Silas was quiet on the walk back to where Rourke had tied the wagon. He had been quiet since Wade's testimony, the specific quiet of a child, absorbing something adult-sized, fitting it into a framework that wasn't quite built for it yet. When they reached the wagon, and Rourke helped Nell up, and Silas climbed up himself, the boy sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the road ahead and said, without looking at anyone in particular, "Did that man help kill my father?" The question dropped into the silence of the wagon like a stone of water, and the ripples of it went in every direction. Rourke looked at Mara. He didn't try to answer it. Mara sat down beside her son. She took a breath. "Wade went there to threaten him," she said carefully. "He left before anything happened. Whether someone else came after, that's what the investigators are going to try to find out." She paused. "What I know is that your father said no. When he could have made his life easier by saying yes, he said no. Because he knew what that land was worth and who it was for." Silas absorbed that. "For us," he said. "For you," Mara said. "He said it was your future." Silas looked at the road for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a gesture that was so thoroughly Gideon's that particular measured acknowledgement of information received and placed where it needed to go that Mara had to press her lips together and look away. Rourke clicked to the horse, and the wagon began to move. The territorial investigator arrived in Red Mesa 4 days later. His name was Ames, and he was a compact, serious man from the territorial capital who had the specific quality of government officials who have been sent to clean up other people's messes long enough to have no illusions about how messy the cleaning was going to be. He set up in the back room of the hardware store, Lenora's store, being unavailable, for obvious reasons, and began working through Howard's journal with methodical patience, summoning people one at a time, taking statements, cross-referencing documents. He summoned Mara on the second day. She sat across from him in the hardware store's back room, which smelled of turpentine and iron filings, and answered his questions directly and without embellishment, because Ames seemed like the kind of man who found embellishment annoying. He had Howard's journal open on the table and was marking certain pages with small strips of paper. "The journal corroborates most of what you presented in the square," he said. "The forged deeds, the pattern of transactions, the timing relative to the railroad route." He looked up. "The question of what happened to your husband is more complicated. I understand that. Wade Mercer's testimony establishes that someone was sent to threaten him. It doesn't establish cause of death." Ames looked at her steadily. "I want to be honest with you about what's possible and what isn't. We can almost certainly establish fraud. We can establish corruption, bribery, coercion. Whether we can establish a direct connection between Ambrose Vale and your husband's death is a harder question." He paused. "I'm not saying we won't try. I'm saying you should be prepared for the possibility that some things will remain uncertain." Mara looked at the journal on the table, at Howard's careful, precise handwriting, all those years of documentation, all those carefully preserved facts, the record of a man doing the only thing he knew how to do in the face of something he couldn't stop. "Do what you can establish," she said. "That's all I'm asking." Ames nodded. "One more thing, Judge Bellamy. What about him?" "He was the first one in line when we started taking statements," Ames said. "He had a complete accounting of his relationship with Vale, prepared in writing before he sat down. Dates, amounts, every favor given and received, going back 9 years. He looked at her with something that might have been dry amusement if he'd allowed himself much in that direction. The man had clearly been waiting for a reason to put that document in front of someone for a very long time. Mara thought about Horace Bellamy standing at the edge of the square, calculating. She thought about the particular exhaustion of a man who's been compromised for years and knows it and hates it and doesn't have a way out until the way out appears. She didn't feel sorry for him. But she didn't feel nothing either. Is he cooperating, she said. Completely, Ames said. Enthusiastically, actually. I've rarely seen someone cooperate with more enthusiasm. The property hearing was officially closed the following week. Ames signed a document confirming that the deed presented by Ambrose Vale was fraudulent, that the original Whitlock deed was valid and controlling, and that all claims against Mara's property were dismissed. He handed her a copy in the hardware store's back room with no ceremony, just slid it across the table and said, "That's yours." She held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. It was just paper. 15 years of her life on paper, declared legitimate by a man she'd met a week ago in a room that smelled like turpentine. The anticlimactic reality of legal resolution, how small it looked on a page, compared to how enormous it had felt to fight for. But it was hers. The land was hers. Nobody could take it. She folded the document and put it in her coat with the others. Walking home from town that afternoon. Alone, she'd left the children with Lenora, who had moved temporarily into the Sutton family's spare room while she figured out what to do about rebuilding. Mara found herself thinking about Ruth Adler, the woman who'd told her that having nothing left to lose and having reasons to be careful were two things that didn't cancel each other out. Mara had thought about that sentence many times in the past 2 weeks, and she'd come to understand it differently each time. Ruth was right. They didn't cancel each other out. But they also didn't have to be permanent conditions. Nothing was a permanent condition. Mara was slowly learning, except the things that actually were the things you couldn't argue with, or fight, or document your way out of. Gideon's death was permanent. Howard's death was permanent. The years those families had spent without their land were permanent in the sense that they were over and gone and couldn't be unlived. But Ruth's situation wasn't permanent. Mara turned that over the whole walk home. By the time she reached the property line, she knew what she wanted to try. The following month was not comfortable. Ames's investigation moved forward with the thorough, grinding pace of territorial law, which was nothing like the pace of a Sunday morning in a town square. Documents were subpoenaed, statements were formalized, Ambrose's finances were examined by people who spent their professional lives examining finances and had long since stopped being surprised by what they found. The picture that emerged from this examination was not surprising to Mara, but it was, in its scale, startling even to people who'd suspected the outline of it. Ambrose Vale had been doing this for 11 years. The 3 cases in Howard's journal were not the only cases. They were the only ones Howard had been able to document with certainty. The actual number, as Ames's investigation revealed it, was closer to 9. 9 families. 9 properties acquired through manufactured debt and forged documentation. 9 pieces of land that now sat along or near the proposed railroad route, having been assembled over a decade with the patience and care of a man building something piece by piece and trusting that no single piece would be examined too closely. Mara heard this from Ames and sat with it for a long time before she could say anything. 9, she said finally. 9 confirmed, Ames said. There may be others we haven't been able to establish the same evidentiary standard for. Where are those families now? Some are still in the county. Some left, he paused. Finding them is going to take time. I'd like to help with that, she said. Finding them. Ames looked at her with the expression he had when she said something he hadn't anticipated, but wasn't going to argue with. That's not usually how this works. I know, she said. But I know this county better than anyone you're going to bring in from the capital, and I know what these families are going to feel like when someone knocks on their door and says their land might be recoverable. I know what it feels like to be told that, and I know what kind of person you need to be when you tell them. She met his eyes. Let me help, a pause. Then I'll think about it. He said yes 3 days later, which Mara was starting to recognize as the standard timeline for men in this story who initially resisted and then didn't. Ambrose Vale's arraignment was held in the county courthouse on a cold Tuesday in February. Mara attended. Rourke drove her in, waited outside he'd offered to come in, and she'd told him she needed to do this part alone, and he'd nodded once and settled himself on the courthouse steps, with his coat turned up against the wind, which was exactly the right response. She sat in the second row and watched Ambrose Vale stand before the territorial judge and hear the charges read against him: fraud, forgery, bribery of a public official, conspiracy, coercion, and the last one, stated carefully and with specific legal qualification, involvement in circumstances surrounding the death of Gideon Aaron Whitlock. The last charge was the one Ames had warned her about, hard to prove to the full legal, built on Wade's testimony and Howard's journal, the circumstantial weight of everything else but present on the record, said out loud in a room that was full of people who had to write it down. Ambrose stood very straight through all of it. He looked, if Mara was being honest, diminished not physically, but in the way a person looks when the architecture around them changes, and they no longer fit the space they've been occupying. He'd spent 11 years being the largest thing in every room he entered. In this room, with the charges on record and his finances examined, and his judge cooperating with the territorial investigators, and his deputy having testified against him in front of 300 people, he was just a man. Specific, accountable, ordinary man with charges against him that were going to be very difficult to argue away. He didn't look at Mara once. She'd thought she might feel something clarifying in that room. Some of its windows were dark, and sensed the questions she'd been carrying about what she actually felt toward him. She'd thought it might be satisfaction, or rage, or grief, or some combination that resolved into something she could name. What she actually felt, sitting in that second row, was tired, not defeated tired. Just the ordinary exhaustion of a person who has spent months in a fight and can finally see the fight ending, and whose body has started presenting the invoice for all the energy that was spent. She drove home alone. Rourke had offered to drive, and she'd told him she was fine, and she was, mostly. The road back to the homestead was the same road it always was, flat and gray and direct, and the cattle were at the fence line when she's pulled up, and the roof still needed fixing on the eastern side, and there were exactly 17 things she's needed to do before dark, and she hadn't done any of them. She sat in the wagon for a moment and looked at her land. 200 acres. Still there. Still hers. The frozen ground and the bare-branched trees along the creek and the cabin with the smoke coming from the chimney, because Silas had been doing the fire everyone sworn since this October without being asked. Gideon's land. Her land. Their children's land. A man from the railroad company came to see her the following week. He was polite and professional and slightly nervous in the way of men who have been told that a particular negotiation is going to be more complicated than they expected. He sat across from Mara's kitchen table and laid out the railroad's offer, $800 for the full right-of-way across the property. Mara looked at the number. She thought about the day. Ambrose had offered her $200 for the whole property in the auction yard, with the crowd watching and her knees in the snow. Its winds were dark. She thought about what she'd known then and what she knew now about the land and the railroad and the water rights and the value that had always been there, waiting for someone to stop stealing it. "I'm not selling the land," she said. "Not any of it." The man from the railroad blinked. "Mrs. Whitlock, the route." "I know about the route," she said. "I've known about it for 2 months. What I'm offering you is an easement, a right-of-way across the southern quarter of my property, enough for the tracks and the necessary clearance, for a term of 25 years, renewable at my discretion." She looked at him steadily. "Price for that easement is $800, payable within 30 days. The land remains mine. If the railroad needs maintenance access, they'll need to request it in writing. And I'll need a clause in the agreement guaranteeing that the easement cannot be transferred to any third party without my written consent." The man from the railroad stared at her for a moment. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've had time," she said. Took the proposal back to his superiors. They came back 4 days later with a counteroffer the same price, one modification to the maintenance access clause, otherwise her terms. She accepted it, read the document 3 times before signing it, and kept a copy in the same place she kept Gideon's deed. $800 changed the shape of everything. Not in a sudden, dramatic way. Real money rarely changes things dramatically. Mostly, it just removes the specific pressure of not having it And that removal feels enormous, because the pressure had been so constant, she'd stopped noticing it as something separate from normal. But now the roof could be fixed and the feed could be purchased in proper quantity, and the $12 owed to the convenience store could be paid. And there would still be money left. Enough to matter, enough to save, enough to give Silas and Nels the kind of small stability that lets children think about something other than whether things are going to be all right. Rourke brought 2 men with him on the first Saturday in March, and they fixed the eastern side of the roof in one day. Most of its windows were dark, working without particular conversation, but with the practiced efficiency of men who know what they're doing and respect each other enough not to fill the silence. Mara made coffee and brought it out, and watched from the ground, and thought about how much accepting help, and how she was slowly, imperfectly learning to do it anyway. "You didn't have to bring extra hands," she said to Rourke when he came down for coffee. "Goes faster," he said. "I could have paid them." "You're not paying them. They owe me from last spring." He took the coffee. "You don't have to make everything a transaction, Mara." She looked at him. He'd started using her first name somewhere in the middle of February, and she'd let it happen without comment, because commenting would have made it into something larger than it was, or perhaps something it actually was, and she wasn't ready for that conversation. "I'm not good at owing people things," she said. "I know," he drank his coffee. "You're getting better at it." She almost argued with that. Then she thought about Orson Vale saying yes in his wool cardigan, and Lenora appearing at her door with the box, and the Sutton boy looking at his mother and saying quietly, "I want to go," and 300 people in a square who decided to stop looking away. All of them owed her something, in the sense that they'd made her fight possible. And she owed all of them something back, in the sense that their willingness to be present had made it real. Maybe that was what owing people things actually looked like when it worked correctly. Not a ledger. Just a web of people deciding to show up for each other, imperfect and inconsistent and real. "Maybe," she said, which was as much concession as she was prepared to make. Rourke looked like that was exactly what he'd expected. The trial, the actual formal trial, separate from the arraignment and the investigation, began in late March and lasted 11 days. Mara testified twice. The first time about the forgery and the debt claim and the auction yard and everything that had led to the Sunday morning in the square. The second time, more briefly, about Gideon's death and what she knew and didn't know about the night before it. The second testimony was harder. The defense attorney, a careful man from out of town whom Ambrose had retained at what must have been significant expense, tried to suggest that Gideon's death was genuinely accidental, that the cattle stampede was a known risk in the territory, that there was no direct evidence connecting Ambrose Vale to the event. He was not wrong, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt was going to be the hardest part of the hardest charge. He pushed at the edges of what Mara knew versus what she suspected, in the precise impersonal way of men whose job requires them to create doubt for money. Mara answered each question with the same care she'd given Ames, directly, without embellishment, without letting the anger she felt at the exercise of it color the content of what she was saying. She knew that the moment she appeared to be arguing rather than testifying, she became easier to dismiss. When the defense attorney finished, the territorial prosecutor stood. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "in your opinion, in your honest opinion, based on everything you've learned in the past 3 months, do you believe your husband's death was an accident?" The defense attorney objected immediately. Opinion, testimony, relevance, several other things. The judge sustained one of the objections and overruled the others and looked at Mara. "You may answer," he said. Mara looked at the jury. 12 men of Red Mesa County sitting in a box trying to look impartial about something that had happened in their county and involved their neighbors and their bank and their judge and their deputy. "No," she said. "I don't." She said it without heat. Without tears, though they were available if she'd reached for them. Without the particular tremor that would have made it more dramatic and less true. She said it the way Gideon would have said it, like a fact that had been examined from every angle and come back the same each time. The jury came back after 2 days. Guilty on fraud. Guilty on forgery. Guilty on bribery. Guilty on conspiracy. Guilty on coercion. On the charge connected to Gideon's death. Guilty on the reduced charge of conspiracy to coerce with circumstances resulting in death, which was not the charge Mara had hoped for, but was also not nothing. was, the prosecutor told her afterward, a stronger result than he'd expected given the evidence, which meant the jury had looked at everything and decided that something more than coincidence had killed Gideon Whitlock. Ambrose Vale received 14 years at the territorial prison. Mara heard the sentence in the courtroom and felt the tired feeling again. The same one from the arraignment, maybe a little larger now, with something underneath it that she needed a few days and some privacy to identify correctly. She identified it, eventually, in the middle of an ordinary night in late March, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were asleep with a cup of cold coffee in her hands. It was grief. Not new grief. The same grief that had been there since August. But the fight had given it somewhere to go, and something to organize around, and things to do, and now the fight was over, and the grief was still there, sitting in its original shape, patient as January. Gideon was still gone. He had not come back because she had won. The truth about his death had been spoken in a courtroom, and a man had been convicted in connection with it, and none of that changed the single most important fact, which was that Silas and Nell's father was dead, and the reason he was dead was that he had loved them enough to say no to a man who was used to yes. She sat with that for a long time. Then she got up and went and stood in the doorway of the children's room. Nell was curled on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, her face absolutely peaceful in sleep in the way children's faces are peaceful when they feel safe. Silas was flat on his back with one arm thrown over his eyes, exactly the way Gideon had always slept. Mara stood there for a few minutes. Then she went back to the kitchen and poured out the cold coffee and washed the cup and went to bed. She slept better than she had in months. In April, Ames sent her a letter. 3 of the 9 families whose properties had been identified in the investigation had now filed successful reclamation claims against Ambrose's assets, which were substantial. 2 more cases were pending. The remaining 4 families, 2 of whom had left the territory entirely, were being located with the help of a territorial advocate whose specific job was this kind of thing, and who, the letter noted with what Mara recognized as Ames's version of warmth, had been made considerably easier by the groundwork Mara had done in the first weeks of the investigation. She wrote back and asked about Ruth Adler. Ames's reply came within a week. Ruth Adler's case was strong. Her farm was not in a condition to be returned. It had been developed in ways that made the original boundaries complicated, but the value assessment put her compensation at $1,100, which was likely to be approved within 60 days. Mara folded this letter and put it in the box where she kept the important documents. Then she went and found Ruth Adler in the room above the harness shop and told her in person, because some news needed to be delivered that way. Ruth listened to the whole thing without expression. When Mara finished, Ruth sat for a long moment looking at her hands. "I told you I had reasons to be careful," she said. "You did," Mara said. "I wasn't wrong." "No," Mara said. "You weren't." Ruth looked at her. "But you went anyway." "I had less to lose," Mara said. "Or I thought I did. I'm not sure that's true anymore." She paused. I had more to lose than I knew. I just didn't find that out until later." Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. $1,100, she said. "That's what Ames thinks. My father built that farm from nothing," Ruth said. She said it quietly, without drama, the way people state the things they've been carrying so long they've learned to hold them steady. "He used to say the land knew who'd worked it honestly." She paused. "I always thought that was foolish." "What do you think now?" Mara said. Ruth considered that for a long time. "I think the land doesn't know anything," she said finally. "But the people who worked it do. And eventually, if someone asks the right questions, that matters." She looked at Mara steadily. "You asked the right questions." "Howard Pike asked them first," Mara said, "and kept the answers safe until someone came along who could use them." Ruth thought about that. "I'd like to go to Howard's grave," she said. "When the weather's better. Leave something." "I'll take you," Mara said. Outside the harness shop, Rourke was waiting with the wagon. He'd taken to coming with her on these visits, not into the rooms, just driving, waiting, being available without making a production of it. It was the thing she'd come to understand most clearly about him over these months. He was very good at being present without requiring acknowledgement of the fact. She climbed up beside him. "How'd she take it?" he said. "Like someone who's been waiting for something for a long time and doesn't quite trust it yet when it arrives." Mara said. Rourke considered this. "That's fair," he said. "It is," Mara agreed. clicked to the horse, and the wagon moved. The afternoon was mild enough that the cold had retreated to the edges of things rather than the center, and the sky over Red Mesa County was the particular deep blue of early spring in West Texas, which was not a gentle blue but a clear, direct one, the color of a sky that had stopped pretending it was anything other than enormous. The railroad men came back, Mara said, after a few minutes. Rourke looked at her sideways. And they want to discuss an extended agreement, longer term, different rate. She paused. They're being considerably more polite than the first time. Funny how that works, Rourke said. It is, she said. I told them I'd think about it. He looked at the road. And I'm thinking about it. She looked at the land passing on either side of them, flat and opening up as they left town. The particular landscape of home that she'd been looking at her whole life, and still found, some mornings, genuinely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with value or railroad routes or what any of it was worth to someone else. I'm in less of a hurry these days to decide things. She paused. I used to decide everything fast because I was afraid if I waited, the decision would get made for me. Someone else would make it. She looked at her hands on her lap. I don't feel that way as much now. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then Gideon used to say something like that. Mara looked at him. He rarely volunteered things about Gideon. He was careful with it, the way you're careful with something that belongs to someone else. What did he say, she said. He said a man who's afraid of the space between decisions usually fills it wrong. Rourke kept his eyes on the road. We talked some the time he helped me out. Not a lot. But some. He paused. He talked about you, your children, the land. He talked about what he was building and why. A pause. He was clear about it. That kind of clear that some people have about what they're for and what they're not for. He looked at her briefly. You have it too. I think you know that. Mara looked at the road and thought about being clear. About the auction yard, and the ring and the snow and the decision made in some part of her she hadn't consulted exactly, but had simply felt operating to get back on her feet and keep going. About 300 people in a square. About the document in her coat. About Ruth Adler's face when she heard the number. I'm learning, she said. You're past learning, Rourke said. You're past the part where it's learning. It's just who you are now. She didn't answer that. It was the kind of thing that needed to sit for a while before she'd know what to do with it. But she didn't argue with it either, which, for Mara Whitlock, was a significant thing. The wagon rolled on. The land opened up around them. The cattle were visible in the distance, healthy now, no longer huddled against the cold, but spread across the pasture in the easy way of animals that have enough to eat and enough space to move. Cabin roof, properly fixed, held no shadows where the light came through wrong. Everything was still imperfect. The $12 debt to the grain store had been paid, but there were other small debts, other small repairs, other things that needed doing in the slow grinding way that running land always requires. Silas had broken his good boots, and she hadn't replaced them yet. Nell had nightmares, still, sometimes, though less often than before. Mara herself woke in the night sometimes and reached for the cold, empty side of the bed before she remembered, and the remembering was still sharp, still particular, still the kind of pain that doesn't get smaller so much as it gets more familiar. But the cattle were healthy, and the land was hers, and the man beside her drove the wagon in comfortable silence, which was, she had come to understand, the thing he was best at, being present in a way that made space for whoever was beside him rather than filling the space up himself. She thought about what he'd said, about Gideon talking about her, about what Gideon had been clear about, and what clarity meant, and whether it was something you've had or something you built. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the folded documents there. The deed, the railroad agreement, the letter from Ames. And underneath them, in the corner of the pocket, the thin curve of her wedding ring, still there. Still in her pocket every day, not back on her finger yet. That was a question she was thinking about, in the way she was thinking about a lot of things, in the new way she'd learned to think about them, without the old hurry, without the fear that waiting meant losing. She was starting to understand that some things you didn't lose by waiting. Some things, if you built them right and held them honestly, you kept. Spring came to Red Mesa County the way it always did, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small increments that you only noticed when you stopped and paid attention. One morning the ground was too hard to turn, and the next it wasn't. One week the creek ran thin and gray under a skim of ice, and the next it ran clear and full, and the sound of it came through the cabin window at night when the wind was right. The cattle moved differently when the coal lifted, with less of that hunched, enduring quality they had in January, and more of the easy, purposeful movement of animals that had enough and knew it. Mara noticed all of it. She'd been noticing the land differently since the trial ended, with a kind of attention she hadn't had time for in months, which was also a kind of attention she hadn't allowed herself because paying close attention to the land meant letting herself feel what the land meant, and feeling what the land meant was connected, inseparably, to Gideon, and for a long time that connection had been a door she kept mostly closed. She was starting to open it again. Carefully, in pieces, the way you open a window in early spring a little at first, to see how the air is, and then more. The morning in late April when Lenora came to see her, Mara was mending fence on the east boundary of the property, the section nearest the creek that had been neglected since the previous fall. Silas was with her, handing her wire and tools with the focused competence he brought to everything physical. He'd developed a relationship with the land over the winter that was partly practical and partly something else, something that Mara recognized as the same thing Gideon had had, that quality of taking seriously, not because someone was watching, but because the work itself deserved it. Lenora arrived in a wagon driven by the older Sutton boy, who had developed a kind of quiet devotion to Lenora in the months since the square, showing up when things needed doing with the reliable consistency of someone who had decided on a debt he intended to honor. He waited with the wagon while Lenora picked her way across the field to where Mara was working. She was carrying something, a length of folded cloth, wrapped around something flat and rectangular. "I need to show you something," she said. No greeting, no preamble. After everything they'd been through together, they'd moved past that. Mara set down the wire tool. Silas looked at the package with unconcealed curiosity. "Go check on the water trough," Mara told him. He went, with the characteristic efficiency of a child who knows when the adults need space and doesn't make a production of providing it. Lenora unwrapped the cloth. It was a painting. Small oil-on-wood panel, not more than 10 inches across. A landscape 200 acres of flat West Texas land seen from a slight rise, with a cabin visible in the middle distance and a creek line running along one edge and the sky enormous above all of it. Most of its windows were dark. It was not a technically accomplished painting, but it had something better than technical accomplishment. It was painted by someone who had looked at this particular land with love and paid extremely close attention to the specific quality of afternoon light on flat ground. Mara looked at it for a long time. "Where did you find this?" she said. "In Howard's things," Lenora said. "He painted, did you know that? I'd completely forgotten until I went through his boxes last. Why? He never showed anyone, said he was no good at it." She paused. "I think he was wrong." She looked at the painting. "I recognized the land immediately. He must have painted it years ago before Gideon died. Clearly. He must have walked out this way and sat for an afternoon and painted what he saw." She looked at Mara. "I thought you should have it." Mara picked it up. The paint was slightly raised under her fingers in the places where Howard had layered it thick the sky, the distant line of trees along the creek. He'd gotten something right about the light. The particular gold of a West Texas afternoon that isn't warm exactly, but has a quality of honesty to it, illuminating everything without flattering anything. "It looks like Gideon's land," Mara said, the way he always described it when he talked about what it was. "I thought so too," Lenora said quietly. Silas came back from the water trough. He stopped when he saw the painting in his mother's hand and walked over and looked at it without speaking. "Is that ours?" he said finally. "Yes," Mara said. He looked at it for another moment. "It looks right," he said. Whoever painted it knew what they were looking at. This was the highest compliment Silas Whitlock gave anything. Mara folded the cloth back around it carefully and held it under her arm for the rest of the morning. That painting went above the fireplace. It went there that evening, after supper, after Mara had looked at the wall, for a long time figuring out exactly where it belonged. Not in a place of honor exactly. It was too small and too modest for that. And Howard himself would have been embarrassed. But where you could see it from the table, from the chair by the fire, from the doorway coming in from the cold. Most of its windows were dark, where a person could be reminded, just by being in the room, of what the land looked like to someone who'd bothered to pay attention to it. Beside it, on a small nail that had previously held a dried herb bundle that had fallen apart the previous winter, Mara hung Gideon's deed, the original, the real one. Howard's carefully preserved copy, with Gideon's signature at the bottom, the T's crossed in that overcomplicated way that the defense attorney had tried to argue was unremarkable, and that Orson Vale had quietly, firmly, irrefutably established was as distinctive as a face. She stood back and looked at both of them together, painting and the deed. Howard's patient attention to the land, and Gideon's patient faith in it. Two men who had tried to do what was right and had paid for it, and had left things behind anyway. Evidence of themselves. Proof that they had been there and had seen clearly and had tried to hold something honest in an environment that kept trying to make honesty impractical. Nell appeared at her elbow. "Why did you put the paper next to the painting?" "Because they belong together," Mara said. Nell looked at them both. "Painting is prettier," she said. "The paper is why we can live here," Mara said. Nell thought about that with the 7-year-old seriousness that Mara had come to understand was not precocity, but simply how Nell processed things all the way through, all the way down, until she reached something she was satisfied with. "Okay," she said. "That makes sense." May brought the investigators back one final time. Ames himself came, which was unusual. He'd been conducting most of the later stage work through correspondence. He arrived on a Tuesday morning looking the same as he always did, compact and serious, with the leather case he carried everywhere, and the slight air of a man who has been managing other people's crises for long enough that his own resting expression looks like mild concern. He sat at Mara's kitchen table and opened the case. "We're closing the primary investigation," he said. "I wanted to tell you in person." He laid a summary document on the table. "Final conviction stands on all counts. The territorial prison confirmed Vale's intake last week. He won't be eligible for review for 11 years. He paused. "The ancillary cases, the 9 families 5, have received full compensation from asset seizure. 2 more will be settled before fall. The remaining 2 are in complicated circumstances involving properties that changed hands multiple times, and those may take longer, but they're in the system and they're not going away." Mara looked at the summary, at the list of names: the Adler family, the Sutton family. 6 others she'd come to know over the course of the investigation, their histories and their losses, and the specific ways that having a piece of land taken from you by a powerful man who manufactured the justification did something to a person that wasn't only financial. "Ruth Adler," she said. "Settled 3 weeks ago," Ames said. $1,200 in the end. The final assessment came in slightly higher. He looked at her. "She asked me to tell you, if I spoke with you, that she's thinking about what comes next. That she wanted you to know that." Mara thought about Ruth's face in the room above the harness shop. The particular expression of a woman who has been careful for so long that hope feels like a foreign language she used to speak, and is slowly remembering. "That's good," she said. "That's a good thing." "It is." Ames closed the case. "I also wanted to say, for whatever it's worth, that this investigation was considerably more successful than it would have been without what you built before we arrived. The documentation, the witnesses, the willingness of people to testify." He looked at her with that expression. That was his version of warmth. "Most of what we needed was already assembled. That was your work." "That was Howard Pike's work," Mara said, "and Lenora's, and Orson's, and a lot of people who decided to stop looking away." "Yes," Ames said, "but someone had to make it useful. You did that." She didn't argue further. She was trying imperfectly to practice receiving things without immediately redirecting them. It was harder than it sounded. After Ames left, she sat at the kitchen table for a while, in the quiet of a Tuesday morning. The children were at their lessons. She'd arranged 3 days a week, with the school teacher who came out from town, a young woman named Clara, who had initially been uncertain about the irregular arrangement, and had gradually become one of the people who appeared at the Whitlock cabin with more frequency than strictly required by professional obligations. Nell had started reading in December. By May, she was reading everything she could reach, including the labels on the grain sacks and the backs of seed catalogs, and once, the entirety of Howard's land records summary, which she'd found interesting enough that she'd asked Mara 3 questions about it, and that Mara had needed time to answer properly. Silas was learning algebra. and hating it with a focused, committed hatred that Mara found secretly encouraging, because indifference would have worried her more. The world was moving forward. That was the thing about it. Even the parts you weren't sure how to feel about, yet they moved forward too, and you moved with them. And eventually the moving forward became just the shape of living again, rather than something you were consciously doing to survive. Rourke came that afternoon, which wasn't unusual. He'd been coming 3 or 4 times a week since March, sometimes just to work, sometimes just to sit on the porch and drink coffee in the particular way of a person who had been alone for a long time and had found somewhere that felt less alone and was still figuring out what to do with that. He and Silas had developed something between them that Mara watched from a careful distance and tried not to interfere with. It wasn't the relationship Silas had with his father's memory that was something separate and permanent and entirely Silas's own. And Rourke seemed to understand this instinctively, the way he seemed to understand most things that required a person to pay attention instead of assuming. What it was instead was its own thing. A tall, quiet man teaching a 10-year-old how to read a horse, how to check a fence line properly, how to tell when rain was coming from the smell of the air rather than the look of the sky. Practical knowledge given without ceremony. Silas received it the same way, seriously, attentively, without making it into something it wasn't yet. With Nell, it was different and took longer. Nell was not a child who gave her trust easily. She'd been born perceptive enough to know the difference between people who were genuinely interested in her and people who were performing interest, and she had no patience for the performance. She'd watched Rourke come and go for 3 months before she'd spoken to him voluntarily, and when she had, her first unprompted sentence to him had been, "Do you know what happened to my father?" Rourke had looked at her seriously, which was the right response. He'd said, "I know some of it, not all." Nell had said, "Do you miss your wife?" "Every day," he'd said. Nell had thought about that. "Mama misses Papa every day too," she said, "but she doesn't say so because she thinks it makes us worry." Rourke had glanced at Mara, who was across the room, pretending to be very interested in something on the shelf. "That sounds like her," he said. "I know she does, though," Nell said, with the calmness of a child stating the obvious. "Can tell." After that, Nell had been more comfortable with him. Not immediately warm Nell warmed to things the way spring came to West Texas. In increments but present, interested. Most of its windows were dark, occasionally bringing him her drawings to look at and watching his face while he looked to see if his attention was real. It was. He looked if its windows were dark. He looked at her drawings with the same direct seriousness he brought to everything, asked questions about specific shapes and what they meant, didn't tell her they were good when he wasn't sure what they were. She liked that. On the afternoon Ames left, Rourke sat on the porch with his coffee, and Mara sat beside him and told him the investigation was closed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How do you feel?" "Finished," she said, "which is different from good." "Yeah," he said. "It is. I keep thinking about what happens now," she said, "in the sense that for 8 months I knew what I was fighting toward. I woke up every day, and the thing I was trying to do was there. Immediate, requiring things from me." She looked out at the pasture. "Now I have to figure out what I'm just living toward," which is a different kind of question. Rourke was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" he said. Not in the abstract philosophical sense, the direct, practical sense. "What, specifically?" Mara thought about it. "The cattle healthy through another winter," she said. "Silas to stop hating algebra, actually no. That's probably good for him. Nell to keep reading. The railroad agreement to stay fair." She paused. "Ruth Adler to find something to build next." She paused again. "Lenora's store to be rebuilt. She's been in the Sutton spare room long enough." "Those are all things for other people," Rourke said. "I know." She looked at her coffee cup. "I'm working up to the harder ones." He waited. She said, "I want to stop waking up, reaching for the empty side of the bed." He didn't say anything about that. He didn't try to make it better, or redirect it, or offer something comforting and slightly off target. He just sat with it, the way she'd come to understand. He sat with all the things that didn't have easy answers present, steady, not pretending they were smaller than they were. "That'll take its own time," he said finally. "I know." She looked at him sideways. "I'm not asking you to fix it." "I know you're not," he said. She looked back at the pasture. The cattle were at the far fence line, moving in the easy afternoon way. Most of its windows were dark. The creak sound came through faintly. The light was the particular Texas late afternoon gold that Howard had tried to capture in his painting and had actually gotten right, which Marcia was still mildly surprised by because Howard had always seemed more like a documentation man than a beauty man, and perhaps those two things weren't as separate as she'd assumed. "I want this," she said. "This specific thing. Right here." She didn't gesture at anything in particular. She didn't need to, this land. "My children growing up on it, knowing what it is and why it matters." She paused. "I want it to be enough to be what I am, what I've made." "It is," Rourke said. "I know," she said. "I'm just practicing saying it." He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read, direct, honest, without softening, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which had become one of the things about him she'd come to value most, that he could be in silence without feeling it wrong. Then she said, "I want to know if what you're doing here, coming this often, staying this late, fixing things that are mine to fix, is something you're doing because of Gideon's debt or something else." It was a direct question. She'd been building up to it for weeks and had decided that the only way to ask it was directly, without softening it into something that gave him an easy exit, because she'd spent enough of her life managing other people's comfort at the expense of her own clarity. Rourke set his coffee cup down. He looked at the pasture for a moment. Then he looked at her. "The debt was settled in January," he said, "when I paid the $1,400. He said it straightforwardly, the way he said everything. "What I'm doing here now has nothing to do with Gideon." He paused. "It has to do with you and your children. And the fact that this is—" He stopped. Started again. "I've been alone for 3 years, and I thought I'd gotten used to it. I found out in January that I hadn't." He looked at her steadily. "That's what I'm doing here." Mara held that. It was the most words she'd heard him say in a single stretch about anything personal. She understood what it had cost him and what it meant that he'd said it without being asked twice. "I'm not ready to call it anything," she said. "I don't know when I will be. I'm not asking you to wait. I don't have the right to ask you that. But I'm also not asking you to stop coming." She looked at him directly. "I'm asking you to be honest with me about what this when you figure it out, and to let me be honest with you about what I figure out, and not to make it into something tidy before it's ready." He was quiet for a moment. "That's reasonable," he said. "It's all I've got," she said. "It's enough," he said. Summer afoot fully, in June, and with it the kind of heat that Red Mesa County produced as a matter of course, not the dangerous dry heat of deeper desert, but the heavy, direct heat of flat land under a sun that had no obstruction for 100 miles in any direction. Cattle needed more water, and the children needed to be kept out of the midday hours, and the garden that Mara had planted along the south side of the cabin needed daily attention. The garden was new. She hadn't had one since Gideon died, hadn't had the time or the energy or the inclination, which were 3 different problems that had felt like one. She'd started it in May, in the ground that the railroad easement money had allowed her to properly prepare, and it had grown with the particular enthusiastic excess of a garden that's been put into good soil after years of nothing. Nell had claimed a section of it as her own. She grew things with an intensity that suggested she was conducting experiments rather than gardening. Most of its windows were dark, pulling up plants to check their roots and replanting them with the cheerful confidence of a child who hasn't yet learned to be worried about failure. Her section was the most chaotic and probably the most interesting part of the whole plot. Silas had helped build the fence around it under Rourke's guidance and had achieved something in the construction that was not beautiful but was solid, which was both the appropriate outcome and, Mara thought, a reasonable metaphor for most things worth building. Lenora's store reopened in July. The building was new, not a reconstruction of the old one exactly, but a building that acknowledged the old one with the same general layout and a new counter and 2 windows where there had been one before, because Lenora had decided while watching her store burn that if she was going to rebuild, she was going to have more light than she'd had before. The reopening was not a formal event. Lenora didn't want a ribbon or a speech or any of the ceremonies that towns produce around significant moments. She just opened the door on a July morning and put the sign out and started doing business. By noon, the store was crowded in a way it hadn't been since before the fire, which was partly because people needed things and partly because Red Mesa County had developed, in the months since the square, a different relationship with Lenora Pike than it had before. She'd always been the woman who knew everything. She was now also the woman who had kept a box of evidence safe in a false wall in her pantry and had walked into a town square with it under her arm. People treated her with the particular respect reserved for someone whose quiet competence has been publicly demonstrated to have mattered. She didn't seem to find this entirely comfortable. She mentioned to Mara, a few weeks after the reopening, that people kept thanking her for things that had ultimately been about the right thing to do and didn't require thanks, and that the thanking made her feel like a character in a story, rather than a person running a store. "How do you handle it?" she asked. "People treating you differently?" "Badly," Mara said. "I'm still not good at it." "Good," Lenora said. "That makes me feel less strange about it." They developed of its word dark, a friendship over the past 6 months that neither of them had entirely planned, the kind that emerges from going through something significant together and discovering on the other side that you'd both been paying attention to the same things and valued the same kinds of honesty. Lenora came to the Whitlock homestead for supper once a week, and Mara drove into town twice a week and sat at the store counter with coffee for an hour, in the way that people have always sat together when they trust each other and don't need to be doing anything productive to justify the time. It was a friendship between two women who had both lost their husbands and both built something from what remained and both understood, without needing to say it, that building something from what remains is not the same as being okay with what was lost, and that those two things exist simultaneously without canceling each other out. Much like having nothing to lose and reasons to be careful. Things that seemed like opposites, Mara was finding, often weren't. Orson Vale came to supper in August. He arrived in his small wagon and his wool cardigan, despite the heat he wore it year-round. He'd explained once, because at 73 he'd earned the right to dress for how he felt rather than for the weather, and he brought a jar of preserved plums that he'd made himself, which were extremely good, and which he accepted compliments on with the pleased deflection of a man who knows he's made something good and doesn't mind being told. He'd testified at the trial in May with the same clarity he'd shown in the square, and he'd been shaken by it, not the testimony itself, but the experience of being in the same room as Ambrose Vale, who had looked at him with an expression Orson described as attempting to make him feel small, which had not worked but had required effort to resist. After supper, while Silas showed him the new fence and Nell showed him her garden section with proprietary pride, Orson sat with Mara on the porch, and they talked about Howard. He would have been pleased, Orson said, with how it came out. "I hope so," Mara said. "I know so." Orson looked at the painted sky in the west, the particular colors of a summer sunset over flat land, which were extravagant in a way that felt almost excessive. Howard always said the truth had a momentum to it if you gave it enough time, that a true thing, properly documented, would eventually arrive where it needed to go. He paused. I thought it was a thing he said to make himself feel better about a job that was often discouraging. But he gestured vaguely at the air, at the evening, at everything that had led to them sitting on this porch. Maybe he was right. He was right, Mara said, but it needed people to carry it. Yes, Orson agreed. That's always the part the truth can't manage on its own. That evening, after Orson had gone and the children were in bed, Rourke stayed on the porch while Mara washed up. When she came out, he was sitting with the particular stillness of a man thinking something through, and she recognized the quality of it, not uncomfortable silence, but the silence of a person who has something to say and is finding the shape of it. She sat down beside him and waited. He said, "I've been thinking about next year." "What about it?" "My place is big enough for more cattle than I'm running. Your herd's healthy now, but you're still working more land than one person can manage efficiently." He looked at the dark pasture. "I was thinking about whether it made sense to work them together. The land stays separate. The operation doesn't have to be." He paused. "It's a practical thing, if that's how you want to think about it." Mara looked at him. At the deliberate care he was taking with the framing the practical, the efficient, the operational, giving her the shape of it that required the least from her if that was what she needed. She understood what he was doing and she appreciated it. And she was also, she realized, done accepting the careful, limited version of things when the actual thing was sitting right in front of her. "Rourke," she said. "Yeah, are you asking me to combine herds or are you asking me something else?" Pause. Longer than most of his Pauses. Something else, he said, if you're ready to hear it. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the ring in her coat pocket, about Gideon saying that's my children's future right there to Orson's at a desk 15 years ago, about the auction yard and the snow and the hand held out to her, steady when everything else was not, about the last 8 months, the fight and the trial and the grief and the garden and the cattle healthy in the pasture and Nell reading everything she could street and Silas learning algebra with principled hatred and Lenora's store with its 2 windows where there used to be one. About what you could build from what remained when you stopped being afraid to build it. Ask me, she said. He looked at her. Direct, honest, without the softening that wasn't him anyway. Will you let me stay? He said, not just helping, not just fixing the fence and driving the wagon. Actually stay. He paused. You, with your children. Another pause. I know it's not a small thing. I know what Gideon is. I'm not asking to replace that. I would never ask that. He looked away briefly, then back. But I'm asking if there's something here that's worth building. For both of us, and for the kids. He said the last part quietly, because he understood that the kids were the part that mattered most. I'm asking if you want that. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what Nell had said to him. I can tell she misses him, and the way he'd handled that, seriously, without deflection. She thought about Silas, standing at the fence, getting the right way to brace a post, the patience of the lesson, and the seriousness with which both teacher and student had approached it. She thought about 3 years of Rourke being alone with his grief and his suspicions and his patience, waiting for something he hadn't quite let himself name, because naming it would have meant wanting things was a risk he'd stopped taking after his wife died. She thought about all the risks she'd taken in the last 8 months and what they'd cost and what they'd built. Yes, she said. One word. Direct. Hers. He exhaled not dramatically, just the small release of a man who'd been holding something and could put it down now. There's a condition, she said. What condition? Silas, she said. He has to be part of this decision. He's old enough and it's his home, and he has a right to say what he thinks. Rourke nodded immediately. Agreed. And Gideon stays, she said. Painting, the deed, the ring, the stories, everything Silas and Nell carry about their father that stays always, and you never ask them to put it down or trade it for anything. Ever. I wouldn't ask that, Rourke said. Not ever. I know, she said, but I'm saying it anyway. Fair, he said. She stood up. I'm going to go to bed, she said, and tomorrow morning I'm going to talk to Silas, and then we'll see what we're building. She went inside. She stood for a moment in the front room, looking at the painting above the fireplace and the deed beside it. Howard's careful attention to the light. Gideon's signature with its overcrossed T's. She reached into her coat pocket, which was hanging on the hook by the door. The ring was there, warm from being carried all day. The thin curve of it, real gold, 14 years, a meadow in June. She took it out and held it in her palm in the way she'd held it out in the auction yard, not as an offering this time, just looking at it, at what it was and what it represented, and what it didn't need to represent anymore, now that she was done being afraid of what she had to lose. She didn't put it back in the pocket. She went to the small wooden box on the shelf, where she kept the things that mattered most. Gideon's watch, a letter he'd written her the first winter they'd had the land, a drawing Nell had made of the family that included Gideon and was accurate in all the important ways, and she placed the ring inside the box, gently with both hands. Not because she was letting it go, because she was done carrying it in her pocket like something that might be taken from her. It was hers. All of it was hers. The ring and the land and the grief and the love and the 2 children and the life she was still making from it. Nobody could purchase it, or forge it, or steal it, or take it from her in an auction yard in front of 200 silent people. She knew that now in a way she hadn't known it in January, when she'd knelt in the snow and held out her hand. Closed the box. She went to check on the children, Silas flat on his back with his arm over his eyes, Nell curled on her side with her hand under her cheek, both of them breathing in the deep, absolute way of children who feel safe. She stood there for a minute, maybe 2. Then she went to bed. She slept without reaching for the empty side. Not because she'd stopped missing Gideon, she would miss him every day for the rest of her life, and she'd made her peace with that, and she'd stopped expecting that the making peace would make the missing stop, because Those were different things. But because missing someone and going on living aren't opposites, any more than having nothing left to lose and having reasons to be careful are opposites. They're just two things that exist at the same time in the same person, and the person carries them both and keeps going. She kept going. In the morning, she talked to Silas. She told him everything clearly without softening it, without managing his reaction in advance. She told him what she felt and what she'd decided and what she'd asked Rourke to promise. She told him that nothing was going to be decided without him. Silas listened to all of it, the way he listened to everything completely, without interrupting, with his father's eyes and his father's habit of sitting very still when something important was being said. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Does he know about Papa?" he said. What he was like. Not just that he died, what he was actually like. "He knew him a little," Mara said. "He says your father was clear about what he was for. He remembers that." Silas nodded slowly. "I want to tell him the rest," he said. "If he's going to be here, he should know who Dad was." "I think he'd want to know that," Mara said. Another pause. "Papa would want us to be okay," Silas said. It wasn't a question. He wasn't asking her to confirm it. He was stating something he'd worked out himself. In the private, careful way he worked things out. He'd want us to have enough. People and food, and he gestured vaguely, meaning the land, the cattle, the things that made a life, instead of just a survival. He'd want us to have enough. Yes, Mara said. He would. Silas looked at her for a moment longer. Then Dad's not getting forgotten. No, she said, he's not. Okay, Silas said simply. A decision made. Okay. Nell, when told, asked 3 questions in rapid succession. Could she still talk about Papa whenever she wanted? Was Rourke going to change things? And did any of this affect the garden? Receiving satisfactory answers to all 3, she returned to her book with the decisive efficiency of a child who has received the information she needed and allocated it appropriately. By the following winter, the changes were not dramatic. Life rarely changes dramatically when it's changing in the right direction. It tends to change in the way the spring came, in increments you only notice when you stop and look back. There was more food. There were more people at the table. Silas was learning things he couldn't have learned without someone who knew them to teach him. And he was carrying alongside those new things without conflict, because Rourke had turned out to be exactly the kind of man who understood that honoring what came before wasn't weakness, it was the foundation everything good got built on. Nell was reading chapter books by November. She read to Rourke sometimes in the evenings, which he received with complete seriousness, asking her questions about what she'd read with the same directness he brought to everything. She found this satisfying in a way she couldn't entirely articulate, but demonstrated by choosing most evenings to read to him rather than to herself. The railroad ran its first line through the county in the spring. The tracks crossed the southern edge of Mara's property on the easement she'd negotiated, and the first time a train came through, she stood at the fence line and watched it pass with Silas on one side and Nell on the other, and Rourke a little behind, and none of them said anything because none of them needed to. Train passed. The land was still there. The deed on the wall, and the painting beside it, and the ring in the box, and the cattle in the pasture and the garden, with its chaotic experimental section, and the roof that didn't leak anymore, and the children who knew who they were, and whose they were, and what they came from, all of it still there. All of it still real. Mara had knelt in the snow in January with her wedding ring in her outstretched hand, believing she had nothing left, and she had been wrong. She had been wrong in a way that cost her everything it cost her to find out she was wrong, and she would not have chosen any of it, and she wouldn't undo any of it either, because undoing it would mean undoing what came after, and what came after was this. The land Gideon had refused to sell, the children he'd refused to abandon it for, the life she'd built from what he left her. Not a perfect life. Not a finished life, those didn't exist, and she'd stopped expecting them somewhere around the 2nd month of the investigation when she'd understood that perfect endings were for people who'd never actually had to fight for anything. What she had instead was real. What she had instead was hers. She stood at the fence and watched the train disappear into the distance and felt the ground under her feet, solid and cold and familiar, and she thought, this is what Gideon knew. This is what he was clear about. This is what was worth saying no for. Train was gone. The sound of it faded. The land was quiet again, and enormous, and entirely itself, and she was still standing on it. That was enough. That had always been enough. She just hadn't known it yet. That January morning when she'd knelt in the snow thinking she was offering everything she had left. She'd been wrong about that too. She'd had everything left. She just needed to stand up again to see it.